Welcome to a conversation on strategy. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Dr. Edward Luttwak, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Luttwak is the 1987 Nimitz Lecturer at UC Berkeley. He is a consultant to the Pentagon. He is on the editorial board of numerous foreign policy publications, and he's the author of numerous books, including The Grand Strategy of the Soviet Union, The Pentagon and the Art of War, and History, Collected Essays, and On the Meaning of Victory. His forthcoming book is called The Logic of War and Peace, and it will be published by Harvard University Press in the fall. Dr. Luttwak, welcome to Berkeley. Dr. Luttwak, you are a strategist. Give us a feel for that vocation. First, how did you become a strategist?
By accident, of course. I suppose I've always had a childish interest in weapons and war. This developed into a layman's interest in military history. Then I had some experiences on the scenes of war, as it were, and I started working as a defense consultant. At no time did I think of myself as a strategist. I simply found myself working on very narrow and specific military problems. The strategy came upon me uninvited as some continuities began to emerge in all these different things. And I begin to see patterns in it. And it is when one begins to understand those patterns that one begins to have something general that one can call strategy as part of one's mental equipment.
If you were asked to give a quick sketch of what are the qualities of strategic thinking, what would your answer be?
Well, what is our normal thinking? Our normal thinking is conditioned by our culture, and our normal thinking is pragmatic. That is, we like to be businesslike in our thought about everything, including problems of defense and foreign affairs. What's the problem? What are the solutions? Let's get on with it. Now, that may or may not be a good idea in any specific case, but clearly it's not strategic. And strategic can be defined in opposition to that as being the attempt to uncover the general patterns and which lead one to further conclusions, which may show, for example, that what seems to be the right move on this issue at this time today to solve this problem may in fact bring you into a next situation which is much worse than the previous one.
And what is the best experiential ground for working with this theory? I mean, is it actually having fought in war, observing wars, studying the history of wars? Well,
I think, I suppose one could get to it in all sorts of different ways. You could probably get to it just by sheer thinking through. I only know how I got to it, and there was really a mixture of all these different things. But what we're talking about is the systematic understanding of just a couple of things. One of them is that when you're operating in the realm of conflict, everything you do evokes a reaction, and that reaction displaces what you're doing. I like always to give the example of the difference between building a bridge and doing anything in strategy. When you're building a bridge, you have a river there that may be very hard to bridge, and sometimes the river changes course with the seasons, but the river is not watching you building the bridge. It's not deliberately trying to avoid being bridged. That is the normal situation in strategy, and therefore it's not necessarily the right thing to do the right thing according to the common sense of the situation. I mean, being a good engineer in dealing with rivers may not mean that you're a good engineer in designing weapons of war.
So this is a realm in which there is an adversary implicit in what you're, who is thinking and moving. So is the analogy here a chess game, really, or are are you saying something different from that?
It would be a chess game if there were rules. But the very essence of conflict is that all the rules are abolished. It's not like business competition, because business competition has rules. There may be a fierce market share fight between two producers or something or other, and they can battle by prices, quality, advertising, promotion, and so on. But they cannot start blowing up each other's shops. And yet, that's the normal thing in war, which is you do anything that you can to win. So it is a chess game where the chess players are also allowed to wrestle with one another, shoot one another, poison one another. And of course, you're not playing on the same board, on the same table, but on two different boards. And each can only glimpse a little bit of the other's moves.
I want to pinpoint one other issue here. Are we only talking about situations of war, or are we also talking about war and non-war?
The logic is formed in war, but wars are rare. As a matter of fact, you can say the logic is formed in battle. Now, battle is a great rarity. During the whole Second World War, which lasted 6 years, really, the battle days were very few and far between. War is rare as well. Everybody more or less tries to avoid war. We have an official and explicit declared policy of deterrence, but all sorts of other people who didn't see themselves as being nice, peaceful deterrence merchants also were trying to avoid war. In a sense, they were trying to win without having to fight for it. So what happens is that the logic is born out of battle, but then it's projected through war, and from war is projected through normal life, where there is no war, where indeed everybody might be trying to avoid war, but where people manipulate the threat of war in order to do various things, including preventing war, and where the dealings of states with one another are conditioned by this background of possible war. And I don't mean just the United States dealing with the Soviet Union, where the threats of war play a role, but the United States dealing with its allies, where the ally, when you deal, let's say we're having a quarrel with the common market over chicken imports or something. Well, the common market behavior in that quarrel is influenced by the fact that there may be a war. In that war, the United States would be the indispensable patron and ally, and therefore how they deal with us on chickens is modified by that fact. Here is an imagined war playing a role in the matter. As soon as this war, however improbable, enters into the situation, with it enters the logical war, which is different from the logic of everyday life.
Now, how is this logic different? Is it more, it's not common sense. You're not saying that. You're saying that there are certain rules that derive from its uniqueness.
Well, the most fundamental, of course, is that the logic of everyday life, common sense, is causal, linear, which is to say that if something is good, it's good, it could be better. Something is bad, it could be worse. If one thing worked today, it's going to work tomorrow, and things of that sort. And in war, all these things are wrong. I always like a simple tactical example. If you want to advance to defeat an enemy, and you have a nice, broad, well-paved, straight and short road, you never take that road. You go over the mountains through a circuitous highway or even a poor path. You don't go in the daylight, you go at night. Why? Because if you do the right and proper thing, the common sense thing in war, then the enemy will be waiting for you and he will defeat you. In order to prevail, you have to go against common sense, systematically in every choice. And in fact, one of the key characteristic of the logical strategy is that it's paradoxical and contradictory right through. And it affects everything. Like in deterrence, when we say we don't want war, that's why we have to be ready to attack at any time. What is the useful nuclear weapon? It's a nuclear weapon you never use. If you ever use it, it's useless. I don't think we recognize the degree to which this contradiction and paradox pervades everything that strategy touches. And it is only rarely visible. But in fact, that is the logical strategy and pervades everything.
And this difference comes from the fact that your adversary is always doing what you're doing. That is, watching you, ready to make and reacting to it, so that you're in a constant state of alert, mental alert.
Well, it's not just alert. It's just a question that if you do anything that is linear, common sense, and predictable, and so on, it must fail, because it can be anticipated, and he can harness all these energies to prevent the accomplishment of what you're doing. And that is why, as a rule of thumb, in war, whenever you have to ask yourself what you're supposed to do, ask yourself what would common sense suggest, and do the opposite. That's the first step in being there. But it is, of course, very fundamentally different, because we've been trained since childhood to try and develop our common sense and extend it and apply it. And what happens in war a lot is that a lot of people fail in war simply because they can't sort of screw their heads around and suddenly adopt a whole set of new mental habits.
As I hear you speaking, the image that comes to my mind is Errol Flynn in Robin Hood and his band of merry men. In other words, in this alert to changing situation, ready to move in an unexpected direction. Now, in reality and over time, obviously, our wars are not fought by bands of merry men, but rather bureaucracies, large bureaucracies. And what I hear you saying about the strategic situation strikes me as very incompatible with the ways of military bureaucracy.
Yes, it's true that there's obviously a problem, and that's why when we examine what happens in wars, we always say that so-and-so won because he was more flexible. In other words, he was less. The Germans were able to outmaneuver the British again and again in North Africa because, although both were large bureaucracies, one was more fluid than the other. But let's not stick to the image of maneuver and agility. There's a much more fundamental logic. This logic has a much more fundamental effect. Take, for example, the question of designing bases and facilities. Let's say you need a place where you recondition your tanks. Now, if you're involved, if you apply common sense logic, the logic of peacetime, what you want is to take a facility, equip it as well as you can, staff the people as well as you can, and this is your repair facility. Now, if you are operating a truck fleet, you have a central repair facility where you repair all your trucks. Now, if you're operating a tank fleet and you have a central repair facility, you're doing a terrible mistake. And what you should really have is 9 or 10 or 15 of them, very dispersed, because otherwise the enemy can prevent you from fielding tanks more than once just by knocking out the one facility. Now, what is it that drives the civilian operator to have one facility? Economies to scale. The savings of not having to have heavy gantries at each of these places. Let's say you have to have testing equipment that you only need quite rarely, but when you need it, you need it. And now, because you have 7 different facilities, you need several different expensive sets of testing equipment. Economies to scale. The efficiency of the design of the facility. This is what common sense drives you. And what you need for war is the opposite.
Now, in our time, the man who was going to revolutionize the Pentagon was Robert McNamara, and he attempted to bring in efficiency criteria. By your standards, his efforts were bound to fail.
Well, what happened, in fact, was that there were always, of course, efficiency tendencies in the system. McNamara was not the first person to come out of the business community and go into the Pentagon. We had a great many of them before him. But it is true that McNamara's advent to the Pentagon came with a lot of fanfare and also came with a lot of people. He brought a lot of the famous whiz kids and so on. And what happened was that they tried to implement efficiency measures against the resistant military bureaucracy. The military bureaucracy did not have basically the gumption or the mental equipment to say, wait a minute, we're not resisting because we're hidebound reactionaries. We're resisting because it's a wrong concept. What you call cost effectiveness and efficiency is driving us towards doing things that would be great if we were in the civilian world, but we're not. They're driving us towards narrowing down a number of different fighters to 1 or 2 which is very smart. If you're trying to get homogenization for civilian production, you focus on one truck and you produce that. It's wrong in war, where the enemy will be able to use the weak points that any machine has to exploit them. They just resisted as a bureaucracy, without ever having a. And what happened was that we had a lot of efficiency solutions put into the Pentagon, in fact, and they were very harmful, because whereas they were indeed efficiency improvements, they were not war effective.
Now, in your manuscript from your forthcoming book, you talk about the air defenses as an example of this failure of the McNamara strategy. Could you discuss that?
Well, I mean, that's a classic. It's a classic case. In designing air defense missiles, under the efficiency rules, what you try to do is you design the best possible missile. You then mass produce it and you distribute it out. You now have a single missile. You have only one stock of spare parts. You have only need one training scheme for the operators and maintainers and so on. In the meantime, the Soviet Union was given an example of the inefficient way of doing it. And they developed for the 60s, 70s, and today, different classes of missiles. They had very low altitude missiles like the SAM-7, the SAM-9 later on, SAM-8. They had medium altitude, SAM-3, SAM-6s.
This is the Soviets now,
yes,
who went on their merry
They went and essentially ended up designing, developing, producing, deploying to this day about 9 or 10 different kinds of missiles. Now, from the point of view of civilian efficiency, this was a disaster for them, because here we have 9 different sets of spare parts, all the different training schemes, non-compatibility. It was a very inefficient array. But when in war, when you fly against a Soviet-style missile defense, you cannot countermeasure any one of the missiles with any one countermeasure, because there are all these different missiles using different principles of guidance. You can't overfly it, because some of these missiles are so high altitude, like the SAM-5, that they go above the height any tactical fighter can fly. And you can't underfly, because they have this ultra-low altitude, and indeed they have a whole range of anti-aircraft guns as well. Now, against the single missile solution of the U.S. produces, you can fly over it, and you can fly under it. And more to the point, you can countermeasure it, because you're dealing with one missile with one set of characteristics. Now, the American solution was very efficient and would be exactly appropriate if we were designing, if you were doing machine tools, let's say, for a car plant in Detroit. The Soviet system is very inefficient, but one works in war much better than the other. The logic of peace is to specialize, reproduce, mass produce, economies to scale. The logic of war is redundancy, coverage, multiplicity, because there's an enemy there who is ready to exploit any specialization on your part to outmaneuver you.
Now, this realm of strategy in a democratic state has to coexist with other realms of concern, and the common umbrella these days is cost. I mean, cutting down costs. There are only so many things we can afford. We live in the age of Graham-Rudman. What you're suggesting about strategy seems to imply unlimited costs for the state.
Well, it doesn't matter what logic you follow. As you point out, you have the discipline of cost. Any society is going to say, this is what I'm willing to allocate for my defense, according to the perceptions we have of how wicked the enemy is and how ready he is to go to war. The logic, however, rules all the same. It rules whether you spend a lot, you spend a little. The question is how you spend it. If you apply the logic of common sense, you spend it efficiently. If you apply the logic of strategy, you spend it effectively. And very often, the effective is inefficient. And the reason it is effective is precisely because it's inefficient. Let me give you a very specific example that shows equal cost. So the whole cost issue is neither here nor there. How do you use personnel? If you want to use personnel efficiently, you put all your uniform, all your military in a computer. So you know what, and they all have different skills and so on. And of course, one is committed to maintaining a certain number of army divisions and squadrons, Air Force, and so on. And what you do is you want to assign everybody to his specialty. You don't want to have a situation where, let's say, an infantry squad, or let's say a tank battalion is short of 20 turret mechanics while it has 15 gunners over. What you want is you want to match skills. Just the same as in a factory, you want to put people working where they can work machines and so on. Now, in war, you follow this approach, and you've had it. Because in the attempt to keep your battalions staffed correctly with the correct, as people come and go and leave the service, perhaps even wounded or tired or whatever, you end up constantly reshuffling the personnel. And you will have a much weaker unit than you have if you accept inefficiency for the sake of having stability and cohesion. A battalion that has too many turret mechanics, not enough gunners, but whose men have been together and are steady and know each other and have cohesion, is going to fight much better than one that is highly efficient in having all the right manpower in the right places, but has no cohesion precisely because it's efficient, because people have to be shuffled through together. What I'm suggesting is actually that the logic of strategy is either directly opposed to the logic of civilian life, which is, of course, merely common sense, or simply, if not directly opposed, then there is nevertheless a clash. And that there is ultimately a very fundamental reason for it, because the logic of strategy is essentially the logic of destruction. For example, we have a navy, which is supposed to be a 600-ship navy. Well, this navy operates in distant oceans and has to be supplied. Aircraft carriers need constant resupply of aviation fuel so they can do all these evolutions and so on. And the non-nuclear ships, which predominantly need diesel, need actually bunker fuel, and of course they need food, vegetables, and so on delivered, and ammunition in case there's a war. Now, the application of common sense logic in the form to this problem has resulted in the design of 50,000 ton, in other words, great big, very efficient, multi-use, multi-product bulk type carriers. We have 50,000 ton resupply ships. Each of these carrier task forces with these aircraft carriers, these cruisers, destroyers, and so on, will be resupplied by one of these 50,000 ton vessels. Now, that's very efficient. If we try to resupply while having small 5,000 ton fleet oilers and separate ammunition ships and separate food and vegetable type of ships, we would have many more ships. The crews, many more crews, it would be much more costly to man, to repair, refit, and so on. But the logic of strategy demands redundancy, distribution, dispersion. And here we have a case where the United States could have, in fact, applied the logic of strategy, chose to apply the logic of civilian efficiency. We therefore have our magnificent carrier battle groups supplied by a very small number of very concentrated supply ships that we cannot replace easily at all. And we therefore are now forced to protect them with a lot of combat ships around them, when we belatedly discovered that it wasn't a good idea to do it the way it's done in civilian life. So I really don't think that it's a question of circumstances. I think that it's true that a band of nomads, let's say a band of nomad warriors, Huns moving over the countryside, are more naturally strategic than a settled civilian population. For them to be agile in reacting to threats, it's normal. The whole logic is the logic of destruction. They're not going to be creating cities which then must be defended and which are vulnerable. That is true. And that indeed has characterized a lot of human history, which is the barbarians defeating the more civilized for that very reason.
Looking at recent American history, Have any of our political leaders evinced a finely attuned strategic sense in the way that you're...
Well, if one has to go back to the Second World War, and I think that everybody who has done a certain amount of reading on it and knows something about it, there of course were many people around who participated in it, must reflect that whereas the United States entered the war only by the choice of Japan, it was Japan that decided the United States would enter the Second World War. And although there was a lot of clumsiness at the very beginning, in a tactical sense, and there were a lot of equipment problems, and technical problems, and there was never, perhaps, in the land armies, the kind of operational skills that the German army. There is no doubt of the superiority of American strategy. American strategy was greatly superior to German and Japanese strategy and British strategy. And it was understood that even when you look at the people involved, everybody very quickly understood that Americans were not particularly good at operating regiments and divisions and so on, but at the higher level, at the level of theater commanders, let's say at the level of higher field officers, Patton, Bradley, above Eisenhower, Nimitz in the Pacific, they were infinitely superior to their opponents. Their opponents came off as much less capable in that regard. So,
and why is that, do you think? I mean, was it the pressure of war?
Well, I think that, you know, of course, it was the great test to it. I mean, we ourselves, even though there's no intellectual recognition, I mean, this perhaps may change with my own book, but even there is no intellectual recognition of this truth that the logic of strategy pervades all of, and it is always paradoxical. We have, of course, empirically sort of stumbled onto it and accepted it and adopted it in many areas. After all, there is a lot of redundancy, nevertheless. There was no intellectual rationale for it, but military tradition had absorbed this as a value, so we keep it. So I wouldn't say that if you overview all our defense plans and the design of all our weapons, the organization of our forces, indeed the nature of our statecraft, you will find it contains a lot of it is, in fact, correctly strategic. But to the extent that it isn't, we created all sorts of vulnerabilities that would then emerge with awful suddenness in the event of a war.
Let me see if I can restate what you're saying. The pressure of war, in a way I think you're suggesting our wealth and power during that war made a lot of redundancies possible, a successful matching of the complexity necessary for war. Well, is that...
Yes, but there was also the fact that although the military were not, before the Second War, the military were neglected and poorly funded and not generously maintained the way they really have been since then, they were also left alone. They may have had very little money to spend, but they were not under pressure to spend their money in a way the civilians thought was smart, and were able instead to spend their money the way the military thought was right, namely traditional. And that tradition embodied a lot of very sound strategic precautions just built into it, which military tradition had absorbed over the centuries since their formations. It comes as a second nature. It came as a second nature to soldiers to provide for redundancy. They merely thought of war. To the extent that we've had a much greater infiltration of the wrong kind of logic since the Second World War than we had before the Second World War. And I just wonder how we would perform if we had to do it again. Before the Second World War, civilians gave very little money to the military, but also left them alone. And they often did the right thing. Since the Second World War, they've given much more money, but much more interference and penetration. And a lot of the stuff, although it sounds smart and sounds right from the point of view of common sense, is in fact very bad. Such as, for example, the Navy with its huge, vulnerable resupply ships that look just like these giant warehouses we see at the edge of American cities, which are the most efficient way of resupplying supermarkets, which you wouldn't build if you were concerned about if your competitor in the supermarket business were free to use arson and launch commando attacks, you would not have all your warehouse capacity concentrated in one place along the beltway, along the freeway. But that's exactly what we've been doing, to the extent we've had these infiltrations.
A problem that I keep hearing in what you're saying is one of democratic accountability, because you're suggesting that the realm of strategy has its own rules, and if you look at the ideal form, this is its logic. And often it seems to be, and you're admitting that, incompatible with what we see as the normal way of doing things. And here, now getting into the problem of democratic accountability, when we have democratic accountability, I think we wind up doing a lot of things in the wrong way. Wrong in the sense not according to your logic. What is the answer there? I mean, we're not going to put our military off to one side and let it do whatever it wants. But so is this the task of leadership here, political leadership, to integrate these two realms in a
first of all,
way?
Not all that the military do reflects the logical strategy. I was merely pointing out that they are somewhere among the inertness of the military tradition. There was a lot of unconscious and unacknowledged logic. Mm-hmm. But to address your question, I think the problem is much more severe when we don't look at all this technical stuff, but look at the level of high statecraft, high strategy, if you like. There we have a very severe problem. I'll give you a very straightforward and familiar example of it in the question of détente. In the 1970s, we had détente with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wanted to improve relations for all kinds of reasons. But one reason was that the alternative of war was foreclosed. The Soviet leaders, whether peaceful or not peaceful, look at the United States and say, well, the United States is very strong, but we can't easily defeat them. Now we have a choice. Do we deal with them, do we try to extend the cooperation and get some technology and capital for them, or do we remain very nasty with them and don't get... So they went on the path of détente. Now that meant that American leaders had to stand up and say two things. I'm a great president. I have improved relations with the Soviet Union. We're now very friendly. Look at me. Here is me. Pictures, you know. Here's me hugging Brezhnev. This is my wife hugging Mrs. Brezhnev. And then had to turn around and say, but you know, by the logical strategy, the reason why we have good relations is because we are strong and we could hit them. And the reason why they want to have good relations is because we are strong. And therefore, my dear citizens, after you've finished applauding me for my ability to hug and kiss Brezhnev, the last thing you have to do, you have to fund me. Now, we have the problem with Gorbachev in more acute form. Mikhail Gorbachev is now smiling and so on because in the range of his choices, one choice he does not have is to launch an attack and win a splendid and easy victory. So here you have an acute problem. But when you get to the technical stuff, the more technical stuff, I think that the institutions we have enable us to bridge the logic if we want to. I think if a military man goes before Congress and say, sir, this is the manpower subcommittee, and you have noticed that we have a lot of units under strength. At the same time, we have a lot of people not assigned to units milling around depots. The reason, sir, is because although we recognize it would be much more efficient to assign everybody instantly, the fact is that we're trying to preserve the cohesion of these units and their sense of togetherness, because we consider that very important. Congressmen understand that. Congressmen would instantly appreciate, in regard to that one issue, that the common sense logic that you should not have both a factory on demand and workers on the payroll that are not working does not, in fact, apply to this case. So I believe we have the institution, if you like, the specific institutions like congressional committees and so on, that can sit down and focus at least on the subjects, where we can bridge this logic if the military themselves consciously understand it, which they mostly don't do. But to the extent that they can understand it, they can literally present it, we can bridge the gap. It's much more difficult at the higher political level in regard to the broader issues, where strategy requires you to behave always in a contradictory way. If If you want to be friendly with the Soviet Union, you have to be strong. If you find yourself in a position of weakness, you yourself are compelled to ruin relations with Moscow in order to create that atmosphere of hostility which enables you to have the strength. Once you have it, you can, for the sake of being able to have a detente afterwards.
Now, what exactly is the problem here? Is it that our political leaders haven't been courageous enough to engage in the political education that requires to say, look, we have to negotiate and reach agreements on the one hand, but at the same time we have to arm? Are they afraid to do that, or they just haven't been smart enough? What is the problem?
I think that they have recoiled before the complexity of communicating these things. Although the specific example I gave you, which is the relationship between the talent and so on, eventually, once we engaged ourselves for long enough, and we went around this roundabout time and time again, this idea did penetrate. I think it could be argued that our leaders could have avoided a lot of troubles by, in fact, engaging in some war education and be willing to confront the complexity of the question. But in general, to operate according to the logic of strategy, insofar as the logic of strategy is relevant. Because, see, in our relations with Canada, for example, the logic of strategy is not relevant. If we are going to be very smart and conflictual and outmaneuvering of the Canadians, we would not be doing good for ourselves, we'd be doing harm. What we want to have between us and Canada is precisely not strategy, but the logical common sense applied. That is, we want to have a creative, cooperative relationship. So we don't want to score points on the Canadians. But insofar as one is dealing with, let's say, the Soviet Union, there too we don't want to just apply the logical strategy. We'd want to, if we can, build cooperative relations. And we have done in some areas. In, I don't know, air-sea rescue in the Bering Straits, we don't ask ourselves how we can score points, but we do the best we can to rescue people and help them rescue us and vice versa. But there clearly the strategy occupies a big part of the total territory of U.S.-Soviet relations. And fundamentally, to the extent that the strategy is present, we always ought to be contradictory. And that's hard to do, because in each case it requires explanations across this gulf that exists between one logic and the other.
So that maybe we haven't been blessed with presidents who can deal with the complexity of moving from one realm to the other, because the strategic realm is clearly different from their domestic realm, the logic there, or, as you just suggested, with the realm of dealing with allies, people that the chances of our...
Well, without, yeah, when allies, with allies too, there are always undertones of strategy. But it's not an accident. It's really not just a personal issue that we are not being blessed with presidents. We manufacture politicians who are responsive to our society. As you suggest, in fact, our process involves people who can operate according to logical common sense. And yet, once they get out there and have to bat for the country on the international arena, common sense is only right for them insofar as they're dealing on cooperative issues, which we may have even with the Soviet Union. To the extent that they're involved in conflictual and adversarial relations, their whole preparation through the domestic process has been the wrong one. And you may contrast, if you wish, with the preparation that a Communist Party leader gets. In order to make it up through the ranks of the Communist Party, the politician has to engage in what might be called a protracted guerrilla war. He has to find little allies, fight off against other cliques, embarrass them, surprise them, maneuver the opposing clique into being responsible for agriculture when the harvest is bad. And by the time they get to the top, secrecy. All of this is done in secrecy, which is very warlike. In peacetime, secrecy is a great drag and inefficient in every possible way, and you avoid it. Of course, you want to inform people, you advertise, send memos around. In the Communist Party, they operate exclusively in secrecy. The internal politics of the inner party are always a secret. Secondly, surprise and deception are very important. For one clique to move against the other, they have to maneuver, really in an agile sense. By the time they get to the top and they sit in the Politburo, they know about information as propaganda. They know about secrecy. They've lived in it all their lives. They know about maneuver. So I would say that the training the Communist Party gives is a much worse training for the sake of successfully managing a civilian society to become more prosperous. But it's just the right training you need for politics as war, that is, for politics with a high strategic content. And it's interesting in that regard that the Soviet leaders have not generally been very good at dealing either with the domestic problems or with their allies, such as they are. But very successfully externally. After all, they're a big superpower with just over half the economic base we have, and with really a very small fraction of the economic base of the United States and all its allies.
If we take this subfield of strategy in democracies and try to relate it to America's present crisis with regard to Irangate, the diversion of funds, the whole set of affairs recently examined by the Tower Commission, what is a strategist's analysis broadly of that set of problems?
Well, I happen to think that it was a wrong thing to do in every possible way. It was also executed very poorly, even it had been a right thing to do, which wasn't. But please recognize that there were some unconscious elements of strategy in it. First of all, strategy tells you, common sense tells you that you should sit down with your friends, and that the cooperation you should develop with your friends. Now, in strategy, the people you should negotiate with to get the highest leverage, of course, are your most fierce opponents. In this sense, the United States and Iran being in having terrible relations between them, it did make sense to try and develop diplomacy with Iran. The next step would have been for the United States government, for the not government, the Americans involved, to give the Iranians brochures and descriptions of all the wonderful weapons they could have in their war against Iraq if they returned all hostages. You return all hostages, and then we'll give you the brochures. Then you promise not to do this and that, and then we will talk about possibly giving you weapons. But of course, we're giving you these weapons to protect Iran against the Soviet invasion. If you're going to use them to fight the Iraqis and continue to make it, etc., etc. In other words, the starting point was unconsciously they blundered into, let's say, the track of strategy, but left it immediately because they applied the logic of common sense. They tried to, Oliver North and company tried, they fell into the classic era of American negotiators, which is to try and build a cooperative relationship. That's what we keep doing. We've had exceptions, and there have been different cases, but the American negotiators meet the Soviet negotiators, and they try to find a common framework. They refuse to accept the harsh and cruel reality that this is an adversarial relationship, and they try to form a common concept and get to it. Then when there's a difference in positions, the natural tendency is to go halfway. In other words, to apply these highly ritualized modes of cooperative relationship to the strategic relationship. And even though Colonel North and these others portray themselves as being tough guys, and as opposed to these striped pants cookie pushers in the State Department, it's interesting to me. As soon as they sat down with the Iranians, they themselves were suckered into the same kind of phony cooperative relationship. And of course, they were simply cheated by rug merchants. But if they had not been cheated, they still would have failed in this negotiation.
Now, reading through the lines of the Tower Commission, one gets a sense that there was in the national security staff a sense of frustration with getting the bureaucracy to do things that they wanted to do. This also would seem to go against your ideal type of the strategic realm and what, in fact, leaders in democratic societies can do. That the CIA may not want to undertake this initiative, or the Pentagon may not want to implement the president's. Do you think that was partly at the heart of this crisis?
Well, partly it played a role. There's no doubt that before we found junior officers in the NSC going off with their enterprising consultants and dubious intermediaries, being active and operational. There's a history there. The National Security Council was supposed to be advisory. It's supposed to be a staff of nice people who sit in offices, look over problems, and write memos. How they got involved into negotiating, let alone into shipping weapons, operating aircraft, and so on. Well, it didn't happen suddenly, and it didn't happen only because they were trying to circumvent the will of Congress, and did it operationally because that was the only way they could cheat, as it were. It all started much more innocently than that, in reaction, in frustrated reaction, to the fact that the departments of governments which are supposed to be operational and in the field, like the special operations, the commandos and so on, in the Pentagon, and the CIA's paramilitary people, they were very unwilling to do anything. The National Security Council would ask the Pentagon, we've received intelligence, we have two, that there's this hostage, he might be rescued, and instead of the Pentagon putting some commandos aboard aircraft, sending them to Beirut and pulling the fellow out if they could, they would say, well, we need more intelligence, we need to do a feasibility study, we need to... In other words, the operational people kept behaving as if they were analysts and advisors and so on, and refused to get into the field. And what happened was that people in the National Security Council did it themselves. That is to say, they used whatever funds they could get hold of, and used these outsiders and so on to organize. At one point, Oliver North controlled, or believed he controlled, what were 40 Druze mercenaries in Beirut. And he was going to use them to rescue some hostage. Now, this sort of desperate resort to improvised operational capabilities in the fields, reached an extreme, really began years ago. In fact, it began under the Carter administration, in reaction to the fact that in order to avoid bureaucratic risk, the people who were supposed to be in the field just wouldn't do it.
So at the heart of all of this, isn't it the problem of intervention, democracies, well, this particular democracy of the United States, unwilling to want to intervene when it needs to? I'm looking now at the whole background of the debate about Contra aid. The president wants to do this. He feels it fits into his strategy. He winds up, instead of dealing with what he perceives to be the adversary, but rather dealing with his adversaries in Congress. So it seems that at the heart of all of this is the inability to realize the strategic logic that you've been talking about in a democracy that has gone through the throes of Vietnam and is very ambivalent in the sense that on the one hand it wants to protect our interests where they seem to be threatened, but at the other hand it doesn't want to pay the cost.
Well, the logical strategy, strictly speaking, has nothing to say on this subject, because what you find at the tactical level, or the operational level, is in turn governed at the level of grand strategy, and what governs it is political choice. There is if you decide that you want to surrender, there is a strategic way of doing that too.
I see. Okay. Well, this is important, actually. Yeah.
The logical strategy never can override the political choice. Indeed, the political choice tells you what is it, that great thing you wish to achieve. I'm just saying that the logical strategy enables you to achieve things in conflict. If you apply it to common sense, to non-conflict situations, it fails, absolutely, just the same as the common sense civilian logic, if you like, normal logic, linear logic, fails in the realm of conflict. But you have to know what you're trying to achieve, and only political decision can set that. Whether the political choice is made by a dictator, by a traditional, emperor, by a madman who happens to have seized office, or by democratic choice through proper parliamentary means and Congress and so on, makes no difference. The political goal tells you what you're trying to apply the strategy for. So strictly speaking, the answer is no to everything. But there is, aside from the logic that is followed, there is a question of the cultural predisposition. And we have, this is a very violent society in the United States, which has been evolving towards a we seem to accept violence everywhere except on a battlefield. We're willing to tolerate much more violence in our cities than the Japanese or Europeans. The Japanese, who are absolutely uninvolved in international violence, who wouldn't dream of fighting wars in Korea or Vietnam, don't accept violence in the streets of Tokyo. And hence there are many more policemen than we have. And the police have much wider powers than the American police force. The Japanese are perfectly willing to allow the police force to break bones of people to prevent violence. Again, in most of Europe, there are many people pay for much more police and give them much wider powers. If they see people they don't like, they can move them on. If these people answer back, they break bones. And if they go to court, the court finds always the police is right. In this country, we don't want to spend money for police forces. We don't give them the powers to be effective. And we accept a lot of violence in our streets. But internationally, we're willing to accept less and less. With 3 Americans kidnapped in Lebanon and killed, we think that's a terrible strategy. Terrible tragedy. If the question about dealing with Central America may involve that hundreds of Americans will die, we consider that's an impossibility. Can't invade Nicaragua, there'll be a guerrilla war, and then we'll have hundreds of people killed and so on. We accept hundreds of people killed in us. It's a cultural, a peculiar moment of transition for a once violent, an activist society. We're in the sort of middle of that.
And are we unable to make these large political choices that strategy is dependent on? Because one has the sense, going back again to this Irangate matter, that part of what may have been in the mind of the implementers of these actions was their inability to get a definitive political decision about what our policy would be in Central America. And then when the decision was finally made half-heartedly, that is during the period when there was to be no aid to the Contras, there was a feeling that, well, the president and his men would go around that decision. So there's a fuzziness
yes,
throughout this whole episode about what we had decided or not decided.
We should be clear, I think. It is perfect, you're quite right, but let me assure you that I never see the logical strategy as inducing, as requiring circumvention of the will of Congress, breaking the law, acting in unconstitutional ways. None of it is necessary. We have mechanisms to take care of it. For example, civilian activity requires promotion, advertising, information, everybody being coordinated, and strategy requires secrecy. Now, can we keep perfect secrecy? No. Is a democratic system conducive to that with a free press? No. But can we provide tolerable secrecy, enough secrecy so we can sort of do something? The answer is yes. Does it require violating the Constitution, bypassing Congress, leaving it in the dark? No. We have a mechanism of Congressional Intelligence Committee. And what you're referring to is actually a mixture of 2 different factors. On the one hand, really wanting to circumvent the will of Congress, behaving in unconstitutional ways, fighting for the sake of democracy overseas while compromising the workings of democracy at home. These were elements in the Irangate. The other element was the element we discussed, the bureaucratic frustration. Staffers, office analysts being frustrated because out there all those rough and tough guys who are supposed to be in the field aren't. Not because they're cowards, but because their bosses are cowards, bureaucratically speaking, they want to send them. The third element, yes, the third element was frustration at the refusal of taking clear decisions, particularly, however, in regard to Iran. Because what was happening was a pattern of intelligence coming in, as we all know, because it was in the papers as well, saying that Khomeini was going to die at any time. Ha ha. He may be around till the year 2000. As you know, his father died at the age of 103. As a brother is 11 years old, he was alive and doing well. Perhaps he should sell his died book. At any rate, they were afraid that Khomeini would die. Then there would be chaos. Then the Soviet Union would come in and help its supporters. And then, quote, we would lose Iran. Now, as it happens, none of this information was correct. But the important thing is the government did accept it as correct. And at that point, and before the National Security Council starts all these dealings and so on, which have become a cropper, its first move is just trying to get a policy paper agreed by the State Department and the Defense Department about what to do. And they cannot get agreement on that. That is, they could not get the clear choice which you need to make the logical strategy into action.
Dr. Luttwak, I regret to say our time is up. Thank you very much for this very fascinating tour of the realm of strategy. And thank you very much for joining us today.